Hey everybody, what's going on? The first round of the NHL draft is now officially in the books, and as usual, I have plenty of thoughts before we dive into this video. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to this channel. Montreal Canadiens videos drop once a week, typically on Fridays. Anyways, let's dive into the first round of the NHL draft. With the 5th overall selection in the 2023 NHL draft, the Montreal Canadiens selected Austrian defenseman David Reinbacher. There's a lot of already question marks about this selection by the Montreal Canadiens, but I'm going to give you the positives and the negatives about what I think the Montreal Canadiens should have done here. I wasn't of the belief that Matvei Michkov was the obvious selection here at 5th overall. There are some red flags, even if he does have game-changing ability. This is the type of player that can absolutely score 50 goals in the NHL, but there's a chance that he doesn't mesh well with the group and ultimately doesn't lead you to being a competitive team when it's all said and done in a playoff type environment. Whereas a player like David Reinbacher, you're going to get that steady 22 to 25 minutes per night, hopefully down the line as a top pairing defenseman. Sure, the floor is relatively safe with this player, and the Montreal Canadiens opted for that over the potential game-breaking abilities that a Michkov could provide them with. But there's nothing wrong with this type of player. It isn't a slight on David Reinbacher. This is a very talented hockey player. It's one that has a safe floor as a top 4 defenseman, and the ceiling is probably a number 2 defenseman in the NHL. I don't know that I see enough offense in this player for him to be a number 1 defenseman in the league. The Montreal Canadiens are clearly putting a priority on building a playoff-style defense, but whereas Marc Bergevin and company wanted to play that mean style of game, that physical, big, bruising style of play in the playoffs, I think what Ken Hughes is trying to establish is that the Montreal Canadiens want to have a lot of two-way defensemen on their back end and ones that have a lot of different varieties that they can bring to the table. If you look at the 6 defensemen that project to play for the Montreal Canadiens when they hit their potential playoff window in, let's say, 2025 or 2026, this is the type of defenseman that the Montreal Canadiens are going to want to play on their top pairing every night. And right-handed defensemen are obviously coveted in the NHL. There's a premium for them. In saying that, does that mean you select for need over best player available? That's a different debate. We already know there's discussions going on about how the Montreal Canadiens are building this team versus selecting that best player available, and I think those discussions are warranted. But let's not take away from this moment from David Reinbacher. This is a very talented hockey player, one that definitely deserved to go in the top 10. There's questions about if 5 was a little high, and for my liking, I would have preferred the team went the route of, say, a Ryan Leonard. But I'm also kind of on board with knowing that Ken Hughes wants to build this from the back end out. Sure, there's still a missing piece up front. They need that game-changing forward that can really take this team to the next level. And it's possible that they're going to also be bad again next year and get another top 10 pick. Even if that's a defenseman-heavy draft, the Montreal Canadiens are likely going to be in line for a forward. I just don't really see how they're going to be a lot better heading into next season. This is a team that still has a lot of holes, a lack of talent on the overall roster. Sure, there's a lot of young talent that's going to be making the jump to the NHL next season, but I just don't see them as ready to be able to make the jump to being a playoff contender in the Eastern Conference. It just doesn't really add up for me. So at the end of the day, I think the Canadiens left some skill on the table to play it safe and take Reinbacher. And there's pros and cons to doing that in the NHL. I think that Reinbacher is going to be that steady defenseman that the Montreal Canadiens are going to be looking for the next decade. And now they don't have to look for that player. They have him in their top 4. And I think you can make the case that you can pair him with Lane Hudson moving forward whenever he makes the jump to the NHL, or potentially even Caden Gooley, and have that really elite shutdown pairing that can also move the puck really effectively. I think there's a lot to like about how the Montreal Canadiens are building their defense for the future, but there's still question marks about up front and how they're going to build their forward core. And I don't even think that trading for Alex Newhook really addresses that. I think there's a lot of upside players that the Montreal Canadiens could have chosen with the 32nd and 37th overall picks that they would have had. Instead, they opted to trade that for Alex Newhook and kind of go for that reclamation project that has that high upside. I'm not really necessarily sure that the upside is still there. I think this is a player that really tops out as a second liner if the Canadiens can get him even further along in his development. But I think more likely than not, he's going to be a tweener, second line, third liner, and that has value to this Montreal Canadiens team, but you're still missing that elite forward presence up front. And although I don't believe the Montreal Canadiens would have gotten that with either of those two draft picks, I think they could have went a better route with how they distributed those assets, even if I do believe that Newhook is still going to be a piece that can perform with this Montreal Canadiens team. At the end of the day, I think there's going to be some question marks about the Montreal Canadiens leaving the last two drafts with Juraj Slafkovsky and David Reinbacher after the misery this team has provided us with over those 2 years. It's been a long 2 years, and the Canadiens are evidently banking on their development staff to really put this team back into contention. And there's big bets on both Reinbacher and Slafkovsky now. And management knows that what their status looks forward into the future is going to depend on how Slafkovsky and how Reinbacher ultimately develop. Those are the two marks they've drawn in the sand. And if those two players don't ultimately develop into the players that they hope they can, I think there's going to be a lot of question marks about how this management team is really going about things moving forward into the future. That's it for me today from Cook's Corner. As always, let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of the Montreal Canadiens selecting David Reinbacher 5th overall, and if you would have made a different selection with that pick, along with your reaction to the Alex Newhook trade to the Montreal Canadiens. I'm Zach Cook. We'll see you later.